women once carried a sacred basket in a big parade. You hear names of gods more often than names of boys your age. The most important person on the Acropolis is not a general or a speaker. It is a priestess, standing near Athena's altar, calm and respected. Men listen to her. That sticks in your mind. By 10, you know the smell of burnt bones on an altar. You know the flash of a blade used in sacrifices. You hear the ritual cry women shout when the omen looks good. You watch young girls, some only 7, chosen to help start weaving Athena's sacred robe. They get to live on the Acropolis for a year. You want that badge of honor more than any doll? Chosen by sacred lottery. You reach young adulthood, maybe around 18, and the pressure builds. Marriage talks start first. Your family needs you married, because only married women can serve as priestesses in major cults. A husband means stability, property links, and legal status. You meet a man your relatives approve of, and before you know it, you are part of a new household. Your wedding is loud, crowded, and full of wine you barely get to taste. You now have the one credential the city cares about. You are a wife. Soon after, the real moment arrives. The city announces that the office of High Priestess of Athena Peleus needs a new holder. This is not a private family choice. This is a civic process run by officials. Your name goes onto a list with other eligible women from the Etiobotadai. You do not campaign, you do not give speeches, you wait. The day of the lottery feels like a trial. Officials gather, likely near the Acropolis or another civic space.
World. They are most prevalent around Christmas time, and thus began a two-party dispute. The Greens were the team of the lower working class, people like craftsmen, artists.
Hey, you're watching my official compilation channel, but if you want to see my newest videos as soon as they're uploaded, check out my main channel, Chat History. Alright, enjoy the video.
History's most ridiculous riots. Usually when you shout out an N-word in public, it can cause some severe backlash, and things weren't much different over 1,000 years ago. Way back in the humble year of 532 in Constantinople, the capital of the East Roman Empire, now known as the Byzantine Empire, some ancient stuff was about to hit the ancient fan. The number one thing to do in your boring life as a citizen of the Byzantine Empire was to waddle on down to the Hippodrome, the city's main sports arena. There, you could watch men race their little horsey carts against each other in the sport of chariot racing. The sport wasn't just one of entertainment, but one of politics as well. There were 4 teams or factions that you could get behind. You got your Rusata Reds, the Albata Whites, the Veneti Blues, and finally the Prasini Greens. The Reds and the Whites eventually got absorbed into the Greens and Blues, and thus began a two-party dispute. The Greens were the team of the lower working class, people like craftsmen, artisans, merchants, or laborers. On the other end of the economic spectrum were the Blues, the uppity rich folk. So the well-to-dos loved the Blues and the limited means favored the Greens. A natural rivalry. Frequently hosting these chariot races was the Emperor himself. And the flavor of the day around this time was Emperor Justinian I, a pretty energetic emperor praised for his various judicial reforms, but also execrated for his harsh taxation policies. Execrated. Here's a new word for you. You see, a few months back, a smaller riot had broken out after one particularly heated chariot race, which really wasn't all that uncommon, to be honest. I mean, look at what happens to cities when sports teams win or lose. Some things never change. Anyway, this particular riot resulted in a few rude dudes getting their noggins knocked. And by noggins knocked, I mean their whole skulls caved in. 2 men were arrested, one green fella and one blue fella. Understandably, they were both charged with murder and sentenced to death. But luck had other plans in store for them. After a freak collapse of the executioner's scaffolding, and thus no other formal way to separate soul from body, the prisoners were instead imprisoned for their crimes. But this didn't really sit too well with the blue and green supporters who wanted the men freed. The lack of mercy really put their tunics in a twist, and they were not quiet about it. Emperor Justinian, who was busy negotiating peace with the Persians, didn't really have time for all of this shit, so as a band-aid solution, he told everyone to take a chill pill and planned to host another, more fantastical chariot race to calm everyone down. But that was a mistake. The worst thing you can tell an angry person to do is to calm down. It rarely works. In January of 532, the day for the chariot race came, and the once divided Greens and Blues now had a common enemy. Since the Emperor was almost always present at events like this, both Blues and Greens would often take it upon themselves to use the time between races to shout political suggestions to the Emperor while they still had his attention. This could be something simple like lowering the cost of goods or demanding the removal of particularly provocative politicians. Well, the topic of trouble in today's turmoil was that of the aforementioned prisoners, both sides united calling for the freedom of the men. But these demands fell on deaf ears, so they yelled louder. The crowd chanted Nika, a phrase translating to the tune of win, victory, or conquer. This was typically shouted by a winning team at the end of a race, but this time it took on a new meaning, and it was directed at the Emperor. But these words would also remain ignored, so the crowd offered two more options, fucking A and fucking B. The crowd leapt from the stands and charged towards the palace, attacking the prison holding the two men and setting them free before burning it all down. The city spiraled out of control for 7 whole days, with fire and property damage destroying nearly half the capital city. Justinian had conceded to a lot of the rowdy crowd's initial demands, like firing 3 of his top guys, but that didn't stop the destruction. They wanted his head. At the end of his rope, Justinian found himself cornered and was forced into hiding. He continued to cower until his wife, Empress Theodora, calmly offered some kind words of encouragement.
Stop fucking crying!
The Empress had convinced him to stay and face his subjects head on. It was better to die as an emperor than to live life in exile, and he took that advice. Sort of. He requested the rioters gather in the Hippodrome in order to propose an end to the madness. They agreed. But entering the arena wasn't the emperor, it was a general and a commander and thousands of soldiers. The gates were slammed shut and secured, starting the rather one-sided negotiation. With one command, the soldiers indiscriminately slaughtered nearly 30,000 unarmed citizens, putting an end to the Nika riot. In the end, Emperor Justinian justified the bloodshed to consolidate power and strengthen his grip on the Byzantine Empire, ruling as one of the greatest emperors of the age. He just had to, make everyone scared to question him. Everyone knows the best combo besides chicken and parmesan is a good old game of sports ball and a medically inadvisable amount of alcohol. Slamming down 1 or 10 beers with your buddies while your favorite teams are all touching each other. Yeah, that's never ended badly for anyone.
Oh well, just a game.
Well, wouldn't you believe it? It caused quite the ruckus back in 1974. An extremely poorly planned promotion by the Cleveland Indians was 10-cent beer night. A night where, you guessed it, you could buy a usually 65-cent beer for just 10 cents a pop. As expected, this wouldn't be without limits. On paper. You see, each guest could only buy up to 6 beers at a time, but the promotion failed to limit the number of transactions per person, so you and your friends could get completely blasted for just $1 or $2. Now, to be fair, the promotional beer was light, only about 3.2 ABV, but when you're double fisting them things down, the math starts to add up. If that wasn't enough of a catalyst for a rowdy rumble, the Cleveland Indians were facing a rematch against the Texas Rangers after having just lost a few nights prior. Thanks to the 10-cent beer night promotion, attendance was near a record high, over 25,000 patrons, double the usual turnout. The game began and the Rangers quickly took a commanding 5-1 lead, which pissed off the Cleveland fans. You're out. The crowd, after slamming down liquid courage for a few innings, started getting bold. The shenanigans began when a fan whipped out his own slugger and dashed across the field. There were a few more cases of relatively harmless indecent exposure, but things soon got out of hand, with Cleveland fans now pelting the other team's players with food scraps and beer bottles, and even some of the more sneaky guests started shooting off firecrackers in the stands in the field. All of these sober folks, realizing that things were about to get nasty, packed up and left before being brought into a brawl. At the bottom of the 9th, Cleveland made a comeback, tying up the game 5-5, but one final disorderly degenerate was about to be the spark of an explosive riot. A 19-year-old fan stormed the field in an attempt to yoink a Ranger player's hat. Not very smart. The fan ended up catching a Spartan kick to the sternum. Now fearing that his own player had been attacked, the Rangers' manager took to the field, bat in hand. Cleveland fans flooded the field and attacked the Rangers, hurling fists, rocks, bottles, chairs, each other, whatever they could get a hold of. Both teams were now fending off all of the fans, but luckily managed to escape the chaos, fleeing within the stadium. But in their absence, the rambunctious rascals destroyed the field, stealing bases and trashing the dugouts.
Well, it looks like I made it to third base one way or another. Right, babe?
The riot lasted just over 20 minutes before police came in and broke it all up, making 9 arrests. All in all, there were no serious injuries and the game was forfeited to the Rangers. Just over 1 month later, a second 10-cent beer night was held to the tune of over 43,000 attendees. But this time, only 2 drinks per person were permitted. No problems occurred. It may have also been due to the fact that there were about 200 cops on site to help maintain order. Back in 1855, the city of Toronto in Ontario, Canada, was really up and coming. Boasting a thriving population of 40,000 syrup sippers, the city had a lot to offer, like 152 taverns, 203 beer shops, and most importantly, dozens and dozens of brothels. Beautiful babes willing to get silly with your willy for the right price. But another form of entertainment was coming to town: the circus. The American SB House Star Troop Menagerie and Circus, to be precise. Acrobats, performers, animals, and of course, the iconic clowns. The show was in town for just 2 nights. After the end of the first night, many of the clowns took the night off from their slapstick comedy to consensually slap their sticks in women's faces at a local brothel. Problem was, they chose the wrong one. This particular establishment was the go-to spot for the local volunteer firefighting brigade. So all night, the men fought for the attention of hardworking women so they could get their dunks sunked. The thing you have to remember is, these were firefighters and clowns of yore, not the type that we see today. For instance, firefighters back in the day were in competition with each other. When there was a fire, they rushed to see who could get there first and get the payout. This often resulted in fire departments banging away at each other while the fire blazed on in the background. In short, these men knew how to fight, and so did the clowns, because the clowns beat up the firefighters so they could get beat off in peace and quiet. 2 firefighters were reported as seriously injured, having to get carted off to be treated for their wounds. But unlike the brothel workers, these firefighters wouldn't be taking this lying down. These clowns were outsiders, and they were about to be reminded of that. The local policemen, firefighters, and many of the town's elites were part of a group called the Orange Order, so they weren't too happy to hear about the showdown with the showman. The very next day, dozens of men from the Order attacked the circus as vengeance. Stones were thrown and fires were ignited, prompting the fire department to show up, only to partake in the carnage. Sorry. After what felt like hours, the mayor finally stepped in to stop the mayhem. The riot stopped, miraculously, with 0 reported deaths. Despite the circus being reduced to cinders, the police did nothing. Why would they? They were in on it. 17 people were reportedly charged, but only 1 ever saw a conviction. The local Torontonians, or whatever they call themselves, didn't really like that response and called out the obvious corruption. To them, they just witnessed a bunch of the local elites destroy a circus unprovoked. The whole fiasco turned public opinion against the Orange Order, and their political power was eventually squeezed from the area. There's fewer things worse in this timeline than the parasites that are scalpers. Scumbags that just buy up and hoard relatively cheap in-demand products only to sell them at a profit once they've forced market scarcity. So you're forced to sit back and watch as several sweaty, sad excuses for humans raid your local shelves for every last Pokemon pack while your child realizes that he's not allowed to have a fun hobby. But the concept of scalping itself is far from new. Back in 1766 in the town of Nottingham, England, many merchants were looking to turn some cheese into cheddar. Nottingham was an English economic epicenter, thanks to the boom of the Industrial Revolution. Brand new factories meant brand new jobs, and brand new jobs meant that people were flocking to the cities to work. These workers more or less came from agricultural backgrounds, hanging up their plows to work with fancy and deadly machines. Well, with all of these farms shutting down, combined with an overall poor harvest season, the country of England was hurting for food that year. Supply was down, demand was up, so prices for wheats, meats, and treats soon ballooned into unreasonable territory. At the end of each harvest season, Nottingham held their annual Goose Fair in October, a simple city gathering where townsfolk could enjoy a bit of fun while stocking up on food and supplies for the winter. One of the more shelf-stable foods at the time was cheese. Entire wheels could last a family a few months in these colder conditions. But attendees weren't about to shell out all of their shillings on inflated prices. Now you might be all, well, yeah, you just said that prices were up because of food shortages, and it's true, they were, but not this bad. Many marketgoers noted that the cheese prices just a town over were roughly half of what was being charged here. So clearly these merchants were being unfair at the fair, but the truth was a lot worse than that. These merchants were buying the cheese in bulk, fresh off of local shipments. So instead of the regular cheese sellers bringing their products to the fair, merchant middlemen bought up all of the supply and resold the curds at marked up prices, pocketing the difference. But this wasn't just limited to Nottingham. The merchants planned to sell those cheeses around the country, cutting off a critical supply of food for the locals. So the people got pissed and began to attack, surrounding all the merchants fronts and backs. They had one demand: sell the cheese here. But the merchants said no, with the fuck out of here. And so the riot began. Roads were blocked, merchants were clocked, and carts were knocked over. If they weren't to be sold at a fair price, they would be stolen instead. Rioters began to loot any and all cheese shops, smashing windows and yoinking what wheels they could, throwing them out to the public so everyone could get their fair share. One of the merchants had a literal boatload of cheese and tried to set sail before being boarded. He quickly agreed to rioters' demands to sell the cheese for cheap, but his boat was still looted on principle. The riot got so out of control that a regiment of the British Army had to be called in. They set up shop and fired into the crowd of looters. But of course, instead of hitting any actual looters, William Eggleston, a local farmer just minding his own business, got wanged by a few rogue slugs. The riot lasted for several more days, eventually dying down once the remaining Kurds made their way out of the city. Remember when companies used to host special giveaways, find a golden ticket and win a big old truck, or be the millionth customer and win a lifetime supply of used toenail clippings? They don't really do those anymore. And for good reason. Something that the Pepsi Corporation would find out the hard way in 1992. In order to hook new customers onto their delicious and nutritious sugary soda, Pepsi held a contest in the Philippines. The Pepsi Number Fever Contest. Bottle caps of Mountain Dew, 7-Up, Mirinda, and of course Pepsi would each have a number printed underneath them ranging from 1 to 999. It was up to customers to collect these bottle caps and wait to see what numbers were announced as winners of various prizes. These were either small monetary or free product prizes, but the grand prize was a whopping 1 million Philippine pesos. This equated to about $40,000 in 1992, or about $92,000 in 2025 money. This was, at the time, equivalent to about 51 times the average annual salary in the Philippines, so it was a pretty big deal. Pepsi saw their monthly sales in the area balloon 40% as people scrambled for their chance at wealth. New prizes and winning numbers were announced each night on television and radio, and the people would redeem whatever prizes they won. The entire promotion ran from February into May of '92. By the end of the run, over 51,000 different prizes were awarded, including 17 lucky winners of the grand prize. But unfortunately, everyone's luck was about to run out, or at least to them, it would seem like their luckiest day of their lives. As a side note, when companies hold sweepstakes like this, they set aside a specific budget and plan out how many winners of each prize there will be to spend that budget. For the Pepsi Number Fever contest, it was $2 million. They had already made that back in the first few weeks of the promotion, but once the budget was spent, then the promotion was over. On May 25th, another grand prize winning number was announced: 349. Since this was a grand prize, only 2 bottle caps bearing the winning number were supposed to be in circulation. There were more. A lot more. Thanks to an oopsie in the manufacturing department, over 800,000 bottles were distributed with the number 349 under the cap. So, in theory, Pepsi was now on the hook for over $32 billion in prizes, almost triple what the entire Pepsi company was worth at the time. Fleets of Filipino fellas and fellettes flocked to their local Pepsi bottling plants to redeem their fortune, but were confused when they saw everyone else with the same supposed winning number. To make matters worse, the company retracted the number, correcting it to 134 the next morning. All of the top Pepsi executives held an emergency meeting to decide a course of action. They agreed to eat into the promotion's profits and count it as a wash. But for 800,000 people, this meant that they could only forfeit about $18 a person. Nearly 500,000 accepted, but 300,000 did not. Thousands of irate individuals banded together, forming the 349 Alliance with the goal of boycotting Pepsi products and eventually receiving their promised prizes. But that wouldn't happen. Over the next several months, numerous small riots broke out, destroying dozens of Pepsi delivery trucks and endangering Pepsi employees. Unfortunately, an extremist protester lobbed a live grenade in a warehouse, popping 3 bottle plant workers in the process. Another device that was hucked at a Pepsi truck ended up taking the lives of a local school teacher and a 5-year-old girl. Yellow. Legal actions against Pepsi persisted up until 2006, where the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Pepsi, absolving them of any future liability for the contest. The contest was a good idea in theory, but it ended up fizzing out and falling flat. It's pronounced Palingopur, and it's ridiculous. Also known as the Eel Riot, this little event is quite the hidden gem in the history of Amsterdam. Let me introduce you to Palingtrekken, a rather curious Dutch pastime. It involves a bunch of your closest friends, a long rope, and a lubed up live eel. Your imagination filling in the blanks a little bit there? Well, allow me to paint a picture. Freaky deaky Dutch dudes would spend summer afternoons attempting to grab a live eel from a rope draped across either a canal or trees, while standing in boats or on horseback respectively. Pull on the dangling devil and be declared a winner. But if you miss your swing, you'll end up losing more than just your balance. It was a fun Dutch tradition for hundreds of Dutch years, until the Dutch government, being the Dutch oven that it was, laid down the Dutch law. Deemed an act of unnecessary cruelty, the practice was banned in the mid-19th century, but that wouldn't deter the population from yanking their eels in public. One fateful day in July of 1886, a group of young labormen were looking to trekken some paling on the Lindelgracht Canal in the impoverished Amsterdam neighborhood of Jordaan. A few local policemen caught the men in the act, being all, absolutely not, but like, in Dutch. One officer sprang into action, cutting the rope across the canal and putting an end to the game. So the laborers put an end to him. The officer was dragged into a nearby cellar and had the ever-loving shit beat out of him. The other officers fled for backup, but this only escalated the situation. Deeming the act of cutting the rope more as an act of oppression rather than punishment, the young men rallied nearly the whole neighborhood, forming a bloodthirsty mob. They fussed about for hours, clashing against police reinforcements, but when nightfall hit, everyone kinda called it a day and went sleepy by. The entire neighborhood awoke the very next morning refreshed, but still fuming, so they armed themselves with sticks and stones to break some bones. They regrouped and stormed the local police station to vent their frustrations. They began to pelt officers with rocks, sticks, bigger rocks, literal garbage. Whatever they could get their hands on, it became a projectile. Knowing that peace was not an option, the officers called in military support. But even while staring down a well-armed army, the mob would not falter. The army decided to calm the rioters down with some live ammunition. Once the smoke had settled, 26 lay dead with 130 injured. But the eel was okay.
Horrifying mythical creatures that you've never heard of. Seldom would you find tales of critters and creatures more terrifying than those from Southeast Asia, places like the diesel of nightmare fuel. First up is the Pontianak, a malevolent spirit with a bone to pick. Specifically yours. All 206 of them. Originating from the likes of Malaysian and Indonesian folklore, the Pontianak is said to be the vengeful spirit of a pregnant woman who either died in childbirth or at the hands of her partner. So imagine that you're taking a midnight Malaysian stroll, slurping down a Malaysian meal of Malaysian soup. Through the aroma of boiling broth and steamy veggies, your nose catches the subtle scent of flowers, your ears, the delicate cry of an infant. It's just then that you spot a figure in the dark, standing beneath a big, beautiful, bountiful banana tree. Gracefully creeping into the moonlight is a young woman, clad in a flowing white dress with silky, long, raven black hair. and friggin' sweet honkers. But that's how they get you. Seduction is the Pontianac's weapon of choice, at least for the initial bait. But as long as you're a nice guy, you should have nothing to fear. And not the Reddit definition of a nice guy. Cheaters, beaters, and legend leaguers all face a terrible fate should they cross the path of a Pontianac, so approach at your own risk. If you do find yourself overcome with the manly urge to try to pick up a ghostly gal in the middle of the night, you'll notice a few things as you make your move. For one, that delightful floral scent quickly turns to pure putrescence. Her soft pale hands now don razor-sharp nails, and her delicate face now bears bloodthirsty fangs. You're in for a rough encounter. The Pontianac has a purely physical attack style, so keeping your distance would have been wise. If you survive the shock of her terrifying appearance, you're gonna wish that you hadn't, as all of your pain receptors will now be the ones screaming. Speaking of which, a Pontianac may choose to let out a deafening wail, capable of rupturing your eardrums. But bleeding ears are the least of your worries, cause soon you'll have a bleeding belly. As a symbolic gesture for the child that she was never able to bear, a Pontianac will take her terrifying talons and tear through your trembling tummy, stealing your stomach, looting your liver, and kidnapping your kidneys. Why? Because they taste good? But if you don't feel like having your insides being converted to outsides, here's what you can do. First and most obvious, don't approach crying women in the middle of the night. It's a huge red flag. Walk on. That's someone else's problem. Second, take a glance down at her piggies. Legends state that Pontianacs have gross feet, so this may be a warning sign to hightail it out of there. Or she might just have gross feet. As a third option, albeit a bit expensive, is that Pontianacs apparently hate the sound of cannon blasts, so if you're facing peril, have her stare down a barrel. Fourth, final, and most effective if you find yourself about to be shredded to bits, is managing to get behind the spooky spirit and jamming an iron nail into the nape of her neck. This is the Pontianac's factory reset spot, rendering her docile, subdued, and apparently according to some strange versions of the legend, she will become, quote-unquote, the perfect wife, at least until the nail is removed. Then she just gets back to her murderous ways. Now we jump ship from Southeast Asia to the forests of West Africa with the Sosobonsam. The OG jump scarer, this slippery little devil, hides in the canopies of the forests of Ghana, waiting for its next victim to wander through the woods. The beings are said to be huge, much larger than an average human, with jaws capable of swallowing a head whole in one gulp. Although oddly proportioned, the Sosobonsam is ape-like in appearance with gangly, dangly arms and legs and a slender torso, often depicted with dark or red-colored fur. Using its iron hook feet to grip a grasp on Ghanaian growth, the Sosobonsam lurks in the trees awaiting its prey. Once spotted, the monster will wiggle its fingies in delight with a "don't mind if I do" attitude, like it's about to grab the last hot dog out of the warm Wawa hot dog cabinet. Going in for the kill, the Sosobonsam swings from the tree limbs to snatch and grab any would-be traveler, should they be caught unawares alone in the dead of night. The monster's monstrous arms envelop you in a deadly death hug, crushing your bones and internals. Luckily, this will most likely send you to the Shadow Realm before it ever gets a chance to feed on your remains. If you are more of a cautious individual, the Sosobonsam may attempt to disarm or disorient you with its ability to mimic familiar sounds. Oh, what was that? Once you've been thrown off course, your life expectancy quickly drops to mere seconds as the swinging vampire monkey man makes its move. But if you don't want to end up a monkey man's meal, there are precautions that you can take. For one, never travel alone in the forest at night. It's kind of the takeaway lesson for this legend. Travel with a companion to avoid an untimely demise and to spark good conversation. And I told the guy, no tomato on the sandwich. And what does he do? He puts extra tomatoes on it. I mean, that's just ridiculous.
Fuck up!
You know, it wasn't even... Additionally, protective charms blessed by your local village priest are said to ward off the creatures as they hate the taste of religion. But if these simple solutions just don't seem possible, don't worry, for another solution is already in the making, and you can thank chocolate. Now, before you embarrassingly offer a bar to the beast, let me explain. You see, Sosobonsams thrive in the trees, so let's just get rid of the trees. Thanks to excessive cocoa farming, Ghana has lost a majority of its primary forest since the 1950s. Sure, the trees are gone, but so is this fictitious freak. Strap on some earmuffs, cause this next creature's a real screecher. Slopped out of southern Slavic folklore, it's a Trekavak, which translates to the screamer. This myth takes on many forms across several different variations of its story, but for this video, we will go with its infant form. The Drekavak is said to be the restless spirit of an unbaptized child, desperate for salvation. According to legend, the Drekavak takes the form of a gray, emaciated young child. Little limber limbs accompany its frail stature, offset only by its monstrously large dome, which definitely devastated a birth canal upon entry into this world. They are most prevalent around Christmas time, sure to put a damper on anyone's festivities, but they certainly will not go unnoticed. Problem is, one glance at this little fellow will make you go, ugh. Not a thought exists behind its bulging, glassy black eyes. No thought, but death. If it wasn't obvious by its name, the Drekavak is capable of emitting eardrum-rupturing shrieks, able to bring you to your knees in a single squeal. Yeah, like that. Now, the Drekavak itself is not an immediate threat in terms of it wanting to convert you into a fresh marinara. Instead, it serves as a looming omen. It is said that those who find themselves in its shadow are doomed to die a terrible death in the coming days. Whole villages may suffer cruel fates should they spot one nearby. The legend itself is often used as a deterrent for young children, teaching them to not wander too far from home lest they cross paths with the diminutive demon. Strange howls or yells in the night from local wildlife are often attributed to the Drekavak as a way to prove their existence to traumatized children. I mean, some of us were told that a giant anthropomorphic rabbit breaks into our houses once a year to leave us candy offerings in exchange for good behavior. So, is it really that far-fetched? Parents do a lot to make sure that their kids behave, don't they? Honestly, I can't wait to tell Little Chat one day about how a small fairy will break in through his window to steal his dead teeth in exchange for a few bucks. Well, like most critters, the Drekavak can be defeated. The most obvious method is having the child properly baptized, finally putting its soul to rest. So, just have your friendly neighborhood priest join the party and cast holy on its unholy ass. Or, splash a cup of holy water in its face. Rest in peace. Japanese folklore. Definitely a very creative culture for instilling fear into kids and adults alike. After all, we need to balance the uwu anime girls with something a bit more fearsome. The Teki Teki does just that. Born from tragedy, this ghastly ghoul is the result of a young woman or schoolgirl who had fallen or was pushed onto train tracks and failed to get out of the way in time, causing her to become 50% lighter, but 100% angrier. I prefer the story of it being a malicious push, as simply just falling onto the train tracks is your own fault. Stay behind the yellow line at all times, people. Being a vengeful spirit, or Onryo, the Teki Teki is a violent little vixen, aiming to hunt down the living who wander around deserted locations or train tracks in the middle of the night. Her existence serves solely as a cautionary tale for kids, discouraging any late-night adventures to such places. It's interesting the tales that parents come up with to protect their children. So instead of it being like,
Alright, Dad, I'm going to that old abandoned factory with some friends.
the hell you are, that place isn't safe. It's more like,
Alright, Dad, I'm going to that old abandoned factory with some friends.
sure, no problem. Just make sure you don't get murdered by...
The Factory Fingerer.
What? Any encounter with a Teki Teki could be your last. While they are just a half-body apparition of a young girl, they're still a force to be reckoned with. You may first become aware of its arrival by the sound of its hands slapping on the cement, which is how it walks, and the origin of its onomatopoeic name. In some tellings of the story, she carries a small scythe as a weapon. Others, she bears razor-sharp nails. If approached, she may ask you a simple question.
Where are my legs?
In Japanese, of course. This is a trick question. She ain't got no legs, Lieutenant Dan. Though, if you see a ghostly gal with her insides spilling out lumbering towards you on her hands, it should be common sense that you 180 the hell out of there. But you'd be wrong. Although she is restricted to just arms for movement, she is noted to be incredibly fast, even able to catch up to cars if necessary. Once she gets a hold of you, she will treat you to a similar fate as her own, using her scythe or nails to crack you open like a football Sunday beer can. Now, according to legend, and unfortunately for you, there's no clear way to defeat her, mainly just heeding the tale's warning to avoid deserted areas and train tracks. However, I'm sure a solid 45-yard field goal attempt could get the job done. What's scarier than a skeleton? A giant skull that flies. Originating from the folklore of the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee Native Americans surrounding the Great Sacandaga Lake in upstate New York, this sizable skull monster is the stuff of nightmares. Dubbed the Ganastastonje, this disembodied, man-eating head's goal is to consume anything and everything. Men, women, children, entire villages, Prilosec, you name it.
These dirigible domes are said to be the cursed souls of ones who have engaged in cannibalism or other various horrific acts within their lifetime. Thus, they are doomed to roam the earth with the curse of insatiable hunger. These heads can take the form of just mere skulls, but some versions of the tale depict them as full-fleshed faces with long flowing hair, either with feathered or bat-like wings. Their description reminds me a lot of those skulls from the Zelda franchise, particularly that one giant fella in the bottom of the well in Ocarina of Time. But I digress. It is said that even speaking about them attracts them to an area, as they have been known to descend on entire villages who keep their legend alive. Once summoned, these monsters begin wreaking havoc, biting and tearing victims apart, or swallowing them in one gulp, only to have to bite them immediately after, since they have no stomach. Their speed and sheer size makes escape nearly impossible. Even if you're hiding in a house like a little frightened mouse or scared as all hell while hidden in a well, they'll attack your shack for a crack at a tender little snack. In terms of defeating them, you're kind of SOL, as legend states that the Ganosastunje is virtually immortal and thus cannot be destroyed, save for one primitive weapon: fire. So, get out your lighter and your pocket can of body spray and get to it. Neat. Well, that was quite the entrance you've made, but you couldn't have picked a worse time to fall out of the sky. Looks like you've landed in Salem, Massachusetts. You know, the place with all of the witches and whatnot? Yeah, that one. Now don't be fooled. It may seem like a simple, peaceful, and wholesome village. Tread carefully, because one wrong move could have you swinging from a rope. So, do you think you could survive this Puritan hellhole? Let's find out. Welcome to Salem, Massachusetts. Founded in 1626, the settlement of Salem quickly established itself as a bastion for English Puritans. They were a group of religious nutjobs who sailed over from across the pond after facing religious persecution. Basically, their religion was a tad too crazy, even for the Church of England. You see, Puritans wholly believed that they were God's chosen few, that only they would be allowed through the cloud-covered pearly gates and everyone else could kick rocks. In hell. They also believed that Big Red Spirit Halloween Satan himself roamed the earth, wreaking havoc as a full-time job. Anything odd or inexplicable was the devil's doing, and any acts of the devil were met with swift punishment. Excuse me, what are you doing? Oh, just having a whistle. Oh. Not in this village, you're not. Pardon me, what are you doing? Oh, for fuck. Being a Puritan society, religious figures were the ones that ruled, and the biblical texts were the rules. Whatever the book says goes, with no room for improvisation. The church itself controlled everything, from the way you walked to the way you talked, from how you were dressed to what you'd ingest. But the church often stressed how you should feel blessed, so if you've ever felt repressed, you must confess or be placed under arrest. Gotta love a concentrated society of religious fanatics. What could go wrong? Right? Fast forward several decades, and here we are in a cold January in 1692, the start of a new year for the town. Well, you've got to get to fitting in, so best introduce yourself.
Good morrow.
Hello.
Pardon?
Bad move. The word hello won't be used as a greeting for another 100 years.
Thou art not from around hither, art thou?
No.
Methought so.
Try again.
Good morrow.
Good morrow. That's better. Remember, the great thing about a small village like this is that everyone knows each other. The worst thing is that everyone knows each other. But it looks like you're about to run into someone familiar? Dude! Ron? Is that you?
Yes, sir.
Where the hell did you come from?
Well, I saw this cool little green portal thingy and jumped right on through.
Heck of a ride.
Wouldn't do it again, though. It inverted my belly button and made me piss myself. Anyway, look who I found.
Who's that?
This loose slab of butter right here is my great something or other Uncle Jimothy, Salem's finest blacksmith, so I've been told.
Oi, how'd you figure that out?
Well, I asked him. Anyways, where were we?
I think we were just talking about... What the hell was that?
Let's check it out.
Oh boy, the two girls pitching a fit on the ground are none other than 12-year-old Abigail Williams and 9-year-old Betty Paris. Their actions are about to set forth quite a series